Okay, we will get started. It is 1 o'clock. Thanks for joining our webinar today with Do Space. My name is Kim. I'm a community learning specialist here at Do Space, and I am introducing Pat Wagner. She is joining us from the Denver, Colorado area, and her husband run a research um, business called Pattern Research. And today she is going to be talking about tips for amateur genealogists. So, Pat, take it away.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And thank you for joining us today. Before we get any further, I want to tell you a story that sort of explains why I'm personally so excited about genealogy. I had been, and I will back up and talk a little bit more about this in a minute, but I've been doing genealogy for a while, and I found a lost branch of the family. And it was a big deal coming from a large Eastern European Jewish family to find a lost branch here in the United States. And I actually went out to the Portland area in Oregon, met with them, wonderful people. We talked about, oh my goodness, we all have curly hair, that kind of thing. And then the mom of the family handed me a photo and she said, one of the people in this photo is our great, great, great grandmother, Florence. And we don't know who she is, except we've heard all these incredible, weird stories about her over the years. And is there anyone who could tell us who's in this photo? And I said, well, my mom is 94 and mom's kind of the oldest living member. And so there's a good chance she'll know who she is. So I went back to Wisconsin where my mom was, and it was pretty much like a situation comedy where everything happens real fast. Mom knew I had met with that branch of the family and was a little wary because they had been having a grudge match for, I think it was 60 years. So I went into Ma's living room, sat down with her, and I pulled out the photo. And without a second hesitation, my mother pointed to the very attractive looking woman who's in the right-hand corner, standing up, kind of with her head slightly tilted, looking into the camera. And she said, oh my goodness, that's Florence. And then started this tirade about Florence and who she was and her craziness and her time in mental institutions and all the things that went on in the family. And I'm making notes, making notes. So I go back to Portland and I handed the information over, and people wept. They said, family's family. We don't know. We don't care about the right or wrong. It's been so many years. It meant so much to everyone. It was like a piece put back in. And I tell people that that's one of the things that is a treasure having to do with genealogy. Even if you think today you have no interest in your family and you had terrible family members and everybody was hateful and awful, for me, it was like putting together a jigsaw puzzle that meant a lot. I always like to start my programs with Do Space with a little promotion because I want people in Omaha and around the United States to know how special Do Space is. And I am not paid extra to say this. A community technology library dedicated to empowering our community through access to technology and innovative learning experiences. Please don't take them for granted. They're terrific people to work with. So my background, I've been a trainer and consultant for a variety of workplaces, mostly government agencies, federal agencies, libraries, universities, and nonprofits as well. And I have some, you'll call it enlightened amateur experience in genealogy going back decades. My family is Eastern European Jewish, and I've done the DNA tests, and as far as they can tell, that's pretty much 100% what my bloodline is. But I married into what you might consider an old Caucasian American family. And they've been in this country since about the 1660s. And except for a couple of side branches in Ireland, basically have been coming from the British Isles going back for a long time. So I actually, without too much trouble, have been able to trace back ancestors on my husband's branch of the family back to, yes, 1381. And I checked it before I put this program together. I started seriously researching my family tree me when I was in my early 20s, because at the time I was a playwright and a poet, and I was writing stories having to do with my family. So I was traveling throughout the Midwest in Wisconsin and Illinois, interviewing everybody I could find. And when I had a little money and some time, I signed up with Ancestry.com about 16 years ago and have not looked back since. And yes, I have found two entire lost branches of the family, and we're able to connect people together. And again, for some of these people, they had been looking for decades to try to know who were other people they could connect with. Also, I have found some lost nests of cousins that I was personally looking for 40 years. And I love the internet because on social media, I can be in touch with some of them on a daily basis. But yep, even after all this time, I'm still looking for my grandfather. I haven't found my grandfather yet. So every program I do has a key idea. And the key idea today has two parts. This is for people who really haven't tried to do any genealogical research to speak of, or started and got stuck, or started and got discouraged, or were discouraged from other people. You can start today with some of the links that we're going to be offering you. And here's the cool thing. You are not alone. You will be, if you haven't already been, pleasantly surprised at how many total strangers are willing to help you because other people have helped them. It's like we're all helping each other to build these trees and to find this information. And I would say 99.99% of my experiences with folks from all over the country have been wonderful, just wonderful as well. So what do we hope happens? First of all, that you will start recording those family stories as soon as possible. I want that to be your number one task, to use technology that wasn't readily available to people like me when I started almost 50 years ago, and to be able to do video and audio recordings and all those folks. And don't wait. That's all I can tell you is don't wait for you to want to build your own database of family information. And when I say your own database, I don't care if it's on 3x5 index cards. I don't care if it's just on an Excel sheet or something simple for you. The problem that I have is a lot of the technology available to build fancy uh, family trees using all kinds of software, which I don't teach on. And the reason I don't teach on is the fact that they're proprietary software. You put together this tree and it's all fancy and nice. Now, how do you share it with someone who doesn't have a computer? How do you share it with someone who has access to a computer but doesn't want to pay for the platform or the software? What happens when there's upgrades and so on? So wherever you plan to dump, in effect, the tree and the information you're building, so that you have this great research tool. At the same time, I want you to be able to put the information in a form so that everyone in your family, regardless of their computer skills, has access to that information. To be able to share family stories, documents, and photos digitally for the future generations. So we actually went so far as to pay a couple of clerks to come in and use our own equipment here at our house to digitize hundreds of photos, and to put them in a form that I can now share with relatives from both sides of the family all over the world. It means a lot. And then they share them as well. And then the other thing, and it depends, of course, on the culture of your family. I grew up around very noisy, fun-loving people who told lots and lots of stories. And even as a little kid, I knew that all the stories weren't 100% true, but I knew that they had power. I knew that they had some place to fill the heart with good things, even though as I got older and started comparing notes and looking at data, realizing that no, I think these stories were made up. They're still important stories to share. So while you're collecting these stories, don't try to be the investigative journalist who decides if people are telling you the truth or not. Okay, don't worry about that. Just collect the stories and collect the different versions of the stories. They're going to mean a lot, not just to you, but to future generations as well, for sure. So what we're going to do today is basically basically it's two or three kinds of things. One part of it is my advice from my personal experience. Everybody's experience is going to be different, of course. I'm just telling you the stuff that I wish people had told me when I had gotten started. Then we're going to talk about some of the different kinds of genealogical resources out there that are available online. And they're in two big categories. One category are sources specific to Nebraska and to Omaha. And the other are national and international resources of different kinds. And we'll talk a little bit more of that. And so this particular webinar is rich with lots and lots and lots of links. And so we're going to go through some of the links pretty quickly to get it all in the time that we have. And every single link, even the established organizations, I personally vetted and checked out. And I would say, when I finished doing the initial research, I had perhaps 100 links. Then I investigated them, immediately eliminated 50, then eliminated almost another 25. And I'll tell you a little bit about which were the ones that I decided not to share. Some old school resources. What were people doing before computers? And what are some of the things to think about? And I'll give you my take on the big DNA question. There's lots of pros and cons out there about, do you share DNA? And I have to say that I am pretty much 100% yes. And it has to do with my situation. But I need to tell you that most of my relatives on both sides will not do the DNA. And that's okay. That's okay. But I'm running into a whole bunch of people who are, and it's fascinating. And then when you get stuck, and that may be why some of you are interested in it, that you've gotten so far, you feel stuck, don't know what to do next. Again, personal suggestions here as well. So first of all, this is Pat's advice. And this is one of these iconic moments where on the left, you see my grandma Fagel, and it was her brother who was married to Florence. Like, I expect you to keep track of all of this. And on her right is her older sister, Musha. And Fagel and Musha were part of a family that came from White Russia, Belarus, before World War I. And they were escaping, the family was escaping the pogroms and the Tsar's draft and all the stuff that was going on in Russia there um, with the with the nascent communists and the White Russians and the Red Russians and the Cossacks and everybody else. And my grandma's favorite phrase she would mutter in English, a pox on all their houses. She and her sister had stopped speaking decades before, but Fagel needed to get her Social Security in the United States straightened out. So we took the family trip up to Toronto, and they basically made their peace with each other, which we thought was very, very nice. And actually, Musha would come and visit us in Chicago and Wisconsin after that. But I remember sitting there outside on the back porch listening to these two old ladies talk about stuff that had happened decades before. And I didn't have a way of recording it at the time. I was like 5 years old and just thinking, if only I had known this sooner. Even as a 5-year-old, I had this hunger to learn about family. So the first thing is this incredible voluntary collaboration, and several of the sites are strictly run by volunteers who want genealogical information to be free as much as it can be, not behind a paywall, even though a lot of it is held by organizations that do charge, for better, for worse. And how many people out there are working on this? And so one of the pieces of advice I have for people who feel stuck, I say, wait a year, wait 6 months. You are going to be amazed at the resources that are going to be available to you. It took me 7 years to track down my mother and father's marriage license because they had entered the data wrong. The government, city and county, the Cook County, city of Chicago, had entered the marriage license information incorrectly. So they had misspelled my mother's Russian name, and the software at the time was not able to find it. And then one day it just popped up and there it was. So that voluntary collaboration is something that is just so much fun. And I have met dozens of nice people who were more than eager to help me as I was to help them as well. Now, there's a kind of data site that I want to warn you against right away. You're probably familiar with this if you've done any research at all on the internet where you've typed in something into a search engine and it will say something like um, the best ice cream, and that will be the title of the site. And you go to the site, and the site looks kind of shabby, doesn't have much graphic or anything, but what it does is it have lots and lots and lots of listings, lots of links to places. Plus there's a lot of ads for all kind of related information blinking and so on. And this is what we call aggregation, where people are just going out finding links and putting them on a site. Now some of these places pay for doing that, are paid for doing this by selling ad space, and not 100% of those ads are valid. And they are notorious for being sites where malware resides and fools you into thinking it's a valid site and so on. But then the other thing they do is they have all this free stuff, and then there's their organization. So it's the Pat Wagner ice cream site, and here's all this free stuff. But when you click on the actual link to the Pat Wagner site, what you find out, it's a subscription service of some kind, and um, I want your credit card information and all this stuff, and I say, oh, the first 2 weeks are free, but then you sign up, and if you want to cancel, you can cancel every time. But that isn't exactly how it works. What happens is you have to sign up immediately. They tell you they're going to give you the first 10 days or 2 weeks free, but then you have to go through a lot of hoops to be able to cancel that particular subscription. And when you read the fine print, you find out, oh, you can't cancel it for a month or 3 months or something like that. So almost all of them end .com, C-O-M, because they're businesses. They're not a nonprofit ending in .org, and they're not a government agency or whatever. They're in that they're in the business of doing things. That made up a lot of the sites that I decided not to share with you. I grabbed a lot of stuff, looked at them, and most of the sites I could find related to genealogy were these aggregated business sites that maybe they were legal, but in my mind, they were not legitimate. So that's something to be aware of for sure. Another thing is, yes, all documents contain tons and tons and tons of mistakes. Sometimes it's because people were careless. Sometimes in my family, it's because my relatives, for the 100 years they've been in this country, have conscientiously lied every 10 years to the census people. And I can tell this because I go back through the records and I find that in 1 year, suddenly this paxil of cousins who I know, none of them speak English, except in the next 10 years, they learn English, and then 10 years later, none of them speak English. Or suddenly they're listing countries they came from that were not the countries they came from, which I know for a fact. Names are misspelled, spelled in different ways. And so the people who are taking in the information notoriously were dealing with people from all over the world. And I'm sure it happens today just as much as it did decades ago. And they transcribe the names wrong, or they do them phonetically, or they get impatient and they give people what they think is an anglicized name version of their name, and can't be bothered. So you're going to find lots and lots and lots of mistakes, errors, and in some cases outright lies about stuff. So be patient with yourself and be patient with each other. If you're a perfectionist, genealogy will put you in an early grave. You got to be good humored about it and say, here are 10 different versions of my great grandfather's name. This is the one that seemed to be used by family. This was the one that was used in Illinois, and this is the one that was used in Wisconsin. Okay, and basically what you're doing then is collecting all the different resources, and sometimes saying, but you know what, this is the one, because I lived with my grandmother, I know this is the name she used every day, um, regardless of what the pieces of paper said. So I'm going to make that my primary name based on my personal information. And then the stories, and oh my goodness, the stories that were told in my family. And now that I'm old enough, I can talk to my older cousins, because my Uncle Harry and my dad were the two prime storytellers in my family, and no, the stories did not match up. And so I want you to collect all those stories, as I said before, keep them at hand. Now, on the serious side, one of the biggest tragedies, and I've experienced this personally, is to go through my late mother's estate, go through the file folders, and she was a pack rack and all the drawers, and I'm looking for photos. And in the back of my mind, I realize there are photos that are missing. And where are those photos? Where are those photos? And at that point, I think, oh my goodness, no. And I go down into the open garage, Wisconsin, right? Open garage area with no doors and cold and wet. And I find the box that she put down there maybe 40 years before, a cardboard box in an open chest and that has basically been soaked with cold water for 40 years. And I cried. I cried trying to separate, do what I can, talk to photo restorers. There was nothing we could do about it, except there were 3 or 4 glimpses of things that if my mom had just even put them in a drawer, right? Not in, I don't know why she put them in the garage. They would be whole. I'm doing this with my husband's family right now, and we're dealing with newspaper clippings from the 1920s and 1930s. If you breathe on them, they disintegrate. So I'm talking to the curator of a museum who has connections with the family about what we're going to do to preserve these long enough. And what they're going to do is to go through them very carefully. And those that are in digitized forms in newspaper, that's going to be good enough. But kind of looking and protecting those wonderful resources, I think is a top priority for all of us, even today, when you think that all of those records are online and in digital form. No, they're not. So some of that stuff that's crumbling in a drawer or crumbling in a garage may be the only record that you're going to have, and taking care of them quickly, I think, is very important. So the link that I have here is with the National Archives. And I started with this because it's a very credible, free source with tons of resources about preservation, specifically of your family archives. Could you ask for anything better? With lots of very good advice and links to a lot of different resources for you. So that's why we put this early on. We want to label things. So I walk into my cousin Kathy's home in Oklahoma about 2 years ago, and she said, "Look what we've done with the family photos." And there was this lovely montage from my dad's side of the family of pictures of cousins and uncles and such. I was so pleased. I knew most of them. We had copies of most of them from weddings and things. And then I saw a photo I'd never seen before, and I went, "Oh, this is wonderful, Kathy." She said, "Yes, we're so happy to have that photo of your father." I said, "Kathy, that's not my dad. That's my grandfather. That's Albert." And she said, oh no, we're absolutely sure it was your father." And I just started laughing. And I said, "Kathy, look at how he's dressed. Look at his shoes. Look at his clothes. Look at his hat. Look what he's carrying. That's my dad was a doctor." I said, that's not a medical bag. My grandfather Albert repaired typewriters. That's his typewriter repair bag. And that shoes and clothing, that's from the 1920s. It's not from the 1950s." And she went, "Oh gosh, of course, that's not your dad. Doesn't even look like your dad." But it became part of the family mythology. So I told her what I knew about Grandpa Albert, and who had died years before I was born. And I said, "Now you have to make sure that your kids and the cousins in this side of the family know that information. I'm going to send it to you in an email. And could you please take the montage apart and label it correctly from the back? Because 40 years from now, people are going to think that's my dad and not my grandfather." I would say half the family photos I have were not labeled. And there are still photos that we have no idea who they were. And I keep hoping someone will have something in a chest someplace um, in good condition. But unfortunately, I don't think that's going to be true. Now, the thing about grudges is interesting. So it was my grandmother's sister, and 2 brothers who basically got really upset with each other when they came to the United States, and then broke off into different areas and didn't know who they were or whatever. And the fact that by the time I came along and was able to connect with these people, you know what? We were all delighted to talk to each other, and we could care less why those 4 brothers and sisters stopped talking to each other in 1915. And we feel sad that we didn't get to know each other sooner, because everyone's wonderful. So I'm going to say, first of all, don't don't be surprised by the grudges. And second of all, you have the power today to stop the grudge. It is not family loyalty to keep up the grudge. And that was something I ran into with a couple of members of my family, and other people have told me, oh, yes, I was considered a traitor because I was willing to walk across the street and talk to that branch of the family that nobody had talked to for years. Most of us have lives today. Most of us simply don't care. So, what resources are available? And by the way, this is a picture from my husband's side of the family, taken, I would say, 2 or 3 years after World War II. And it's of his mother, mostly his mother's family, because it's his mother with her sister and brother and all of their kids, and my father-in-law, and then the woman in the center is the grandma who I never met. But all of those other people have been part of my lives for at least 40 years. And it's fun to look at the photo and say, and that person now is a doctor, and that person now was head of a railroad division of a railroad, and that particular person was a contractor building multi-million dollar homes, and that particular person was a legal secretary and stuff. So we've had great fun with that. But unfortunately, not all of us get to have these kind of formal portraits. And it's one of my most precious possessions for my husband's side of the family. Types of resources. I think what people forget is that any place that keeps a government record, any place that families interact with, can become a resource for genealogy. A couple of these that we sometimes forget are museums. Cemeteries are standalones. Graveyards usually are attached to a church or some religious organization. All the different cultural groups out there keep records of different kinds. There are legitimate private genealogical services and paid consultants. For example, if I was to do research on the family in Winnipeg in Manitoba, up in Canada, the Genealogical Society up there has paid services that are totally legitimate, that people can go in and look at records and things that you need to do. Newspapers still have morgues because not all newspapers have online archives, and so there are places you can physically go and see what's there. There's courthouses, for example, university records. We found some very important information about one of my husband's relatives because of a long biography that was written by his alumni association at Princeton University when his great grandfather passed on. And some of the things that were in that bio weren't available anyplace else. And then there's what I like to call the treasure hunts, which really happen in small towns, estate sales and thrift stores and old houses and things. So we are surrounded by information. And yes, it can feel a little overwhelming at times, for sure. It's kind of like having this big knotted ball of yarn. Just pull out a thread somewhere and get started, is what we tell people. So we are now going to, not at lightning speed, but kind of keeping it going, tell you about some of the resources that are available in Nebraska, and then talk a little bit about some of the important national resources that are available. And again, most of what I was digging for were nonprofit and um, public sector agencies, with a few exceptions. So this is the Nebraska State Genealogical Society, and it has a membership that you can pay for $20 a year for individuals, which is an incredible bargain. And this again is a place, if most of your family is in Nebraska, and it's true of any state you come from because every state has their genealogical societies, you immediately are going to be able to find a lot of information. And I think it's really important if you come from a family where everyone has the same name. One of my mentors in genealogy, a librarian and genealogist in Texas named Willie Broadway, Willie told me that she earned her gold badge as a genealogist before she officially became a genealogist and a librarian, because 3 of the 4 branches of her family were named Jones. And she said, I untangled that. I can untangle anything. So one of the reasons you want to check in with state genealogical societies is that if everybody in your family is named Jones or Smith, they've seen it before and they can deal with it and help you untangle what's there. This is a very interesting project, and it's a part of a national project, which is the GenWeb project, and this is the Nebraska branch of it. And what they have put together are state and county sites. And what they're looking for is to try to promote free genealogical research in Nebraska. And so there's lots of people looking for lots and lots of different information in different areas that's free and available. So they're another place that if you're in Nebraska, definitely needs to be part of your favored resources. Now, this is kind of interesting. This is called the Nebraska Access, offers free 24/7 access to websites selected by librarians, full-text governmental publications, and Nebraska historical resources as well. And so what we want to do is know you've got something called Nebraska Access, and then which offers a whole bunch of different websites. And then very specifically, that second link is to specific genealogical websites as well, and databases and stuff, just tons of great information. You also have something, and this is called the Nebraska Death Index, and it has an interesting story. There's an organization called Reclaim the Records, and Reclaim the Records is a national nonprofit organization devoted to getting states in particular to give up, you might say, the protection of information that should be free and available to people, particularly who want to do genealogical research. And they go state by state. Every state has a different one, and they file Freedom of Information Act petitions. I don't think they've had to sue anyone in the state of Nebraska, but basically say there's absolutely no good reason why these things are behind paywalls, and they were created by tax funds and they should be available. And the organization itself is called Reclaim the Records. It's worth a look. And then what you have is the Nebraska Death Index.com, which is an example of this. And even though it's a .com as a business, it is free and searchable. And it's another terrific way to find a lot of information. Very significant information is often in death records and obituaries. The only way that I was able to find the name of my Aunt Marilyn's third husband was in her obituary. That was where I was able to find that name. You also have the US GenWeb, and it's another one of these places where people are collecting information and finding places to put it. And in effect, every state has a USG W archives. And this is the website for the one in Nebraska. And again, a lot of individuals sharing information. Some of these websites, I'll be honest with you, aren't pretty, right? They're not pretty. They're just there as places to hold information, as it were. Okay. Now, this was one that when I first looked at it, I went, is this for real? And then I found out, yep, it's for real. It started as a research project where people who were working in government needed to have access to what was going around the country at the county level. And what it is, it's a database providing free access to government websites, contact information, and public records in all 50 states. All 50 states. The place to find out about Nebraska is countyoffice.org, and at any dash genealogy as we have here. And when I started looking at this, I didn't believe it was true. So what I did is I went back to I went to Colorado, and I went to rural Colorado, where my husband's family is from, and went to Chicago and went to Wisconsin, went to various places where I'd already done research and known family, and there was the information I needed. I was so impressed, so impressed. So again, I can't believe this is out there available to people, but so much of what we need to know is at the county level. Now, the thing is, it doesn't necessarily give you the detail, but it tells you where to go, who to talk to. In this day and age with the pandemic, it's sort of like we're preparing for those times then we can visit in person. Because the truth is, a lot of these offices are locked down. The county office, for example, down in Huerfano County, where my husband's family ranch is, their county office has been locked down for months. And I don't think right now they're even accepting visitors. But you can get really intelligent, friendly people on the phone to give you some guidance and information for the time that you do go down there and are able to start physically looking through records again. It's pretty cool. Nebraska Vital Records. So now we're going to be talking about government. The Nebraska Department of Health and Human Services, and this is where you get the birth certificates, the death certificates, the marriage certificates, and what's also important, the divorce statistics. The divorce statistics, because, you know, people married a lot in olden times. You might think that, oh, divorce was invented in 1965. No, most of my family who I've been able to track down, there's more than one marriage. And there was information that I was able to find on my grandmother's divorce papers from her first husband that I would not have been able to have access to that information. Now, they say, because people get confused, no, this is not where you get the census records. People think there is one ginormous government office that has everything in the world for everybody in the world. And that's simply not true. But they do warn people right off, please do your research, that there are legal limits to what you might have access to. Some places are pretty open about being able to get to, for example, birth records. But because of identity theft, there's a lot of places out there that say, no, we keep hold of these records for a long time. And unless you can prove certain legalities, which are different from state to state and from country to country, we're not going to let you have them. So one of the things that the Department of Health and Human Services in Nebraska alerts you to is that you can't have information that's more recent than 50 years. So you can have access to or order a birth certificate unless you have can show a legitimate connection there. Now, for me, trying to get information about Canadian relatives, Canada, the limit on being able to get information is 100 years. I waited patiently for my mom lived till her 99th birthday. And then the next year where she would have been 100, I contacted that province again and they said, oh, we decided to change it to 102 years. So I have to wait another year before I can get that information. So that's one of those roadblocks that it's really hard to get around unless you have someone who's a lawyer who knows how to get the information as valid. And they do a lot of that to protect people, again, from identity theft and from bad use of resources. So, it's not the end of the world for sure. The Nebraska State Historical Society, it's kind of like two sides of the same coin when you talk about genealogy and history. I know people in the past who made very good businesses being able to give people historical research about a town that their family was in or a historical period, like what was it like during the last year or two of the Civil War? What was it like living in New York City in 1910? Information like that. So oftentimes genealogists will, let's put it, haunt historical societies and be the driving force behind the historical societies. And you get all kinds of books and information and so on. So remember to use the word history, particularly at the local level, if you're looking for those kind of resources. And this is the State Historical Society. Another resource that is available comes from History Nebraska. And if you notice this, you have the Historical Society, which is a .org, O-R-G, and then History Nebraska, and this is like the government side of what's basically the same agency. And so I picked one of the things they had, which I thought was pretty cool, and this was the cemetery registry. And again, having access to that kind of information gives you wonderful resources. And sometimes that's the only place you can find information. When I went back to visit Wisconsin a couple of years ago when we were still traveling, I visited where my parents were divorced. I visited where my mother was buried and where my father was buried. And I was amazed at the information that the people at the cemetery, which it's on the National um, historical register, and it's a nonprofit, had about all the different people who were buried there and historical records. And they've actually asked me, because my dad had a little prominence in the town when he lived there, if I could put together some sort of program. And when things open up from the pandemic, they would like me to come out and do one of their programs about my dad's background and who he was and things like that. So oftentimes these kinds of cemetery organizations are places to find information. And remember, some cemeteries are run by government agencies, usually local government. Some are nonprofit and religious organizations, and then there's also commercial ones as well. And they each have different kinds of information. So now wanted to take you through some of the resources available that are national or international resources. One of them is the Find a Grave. Now, let's be honest, when you say 190 million memorials, that's a lot. But when you think of the many, many millions of people who have lived and died in North America, you suddenly realize that that's only part of who's there. So I have to say, and I think I included it in the program, that I was able to find my great grandparents on my dad's mother's side, my their gravestones, but every time I look, which is every 2 or 3 months, maybe I find someone else. But think of the fact that there are people out there, even now with the pandemic, who are going through cemeteries, taking photos, listing information. So Find a Grave is one of those resources we really want everyone to use, even if after the first couple of tries you aren't getting anywhere, because more and more names are always being added, more names and photos about stuff. Now, this was one which I think was very interesting, and even though it has a .com on it, I felt it was okay. You know what I mean? That there wasn't a hidden cost. And it's, everyone in America joins a club and then they get dissatisfied with the club and they leave the club and they start another club that they think is better. And that process goes over and over and over again. So there are several clusters of groups of genealogists, amateur and professional, who aren't satisfied with a service and they think they can do better, so they start their own. And I think, this is my guess, that this Wikitree site is one of those examples. And they call themselves Where Genealogists Collaborate. And they have people attached to it who volunteer to take care of different sections of it. And they ask people if you're serious to sign a letter of agreement or whatever, but the resources are out there and they're free and people are adding to them all the time. Again, not the prettiest website in the world, but they've done a really good job. And I feel comfortable saying, even though I didn't spend 3 years making sure that they were legitimate, I think it's worthwhile to check them out. I don't feel like suddenly you're going to get a bill in the mail for $100 because you're checking them out. Well, what if you are from a group that isn't the everyday folks who showed up at Ellis Island? Okay, there are several organizations, regional and national, centered around issues having to do with African American genealogy. And of course, we have the records from slave times. We have people from different countries coming in at different points of view. And this was one that I found that I really liked. I love their mission statement. Every person of African descent knows their family history. That's their vision and mission statement. I think that it's really worthwhile checking in with local museums and organizations as well. Churches for sure, were oftentimes that were the only kind of records that were kept. But if you are of African American ancestry and you're trying to figure out things and don't know where to start, I think this is a good place to start. To have people who understand the frustrations of what you're trying to find out about your family. The same goes with Native American genealogy. And again, I love their mission statement to connect generations. And even though ORG at the end, they're a place that spends a lot of time explaining to people, and I'm sure this is because they get these kind of phone calls all the time. This is what we can do for you that's free. This is where we can help you. However, we don't do free research. And because of the trickiness that has to do with Native American information and people who are wanting to be enrolled members of tribes for various, personal satisfaction, and in some cases, money, power, whatever, they're really, really careful. And I agree with what they wrote in their website that there's a kind of research that you're going to have to pay for it because of the time and effort it has taken to accumulate records. Like one of the things they pointed out is that the staff and the people connected with this have visited personally hundreds of county courthouses and places looking through records to find information that were necessary. And they also are connected with one of the most credible groups, ancestry.com, also helping people with sometimes confusing DNA information. And we'll talk about that in a minute as well. So this would be something definitely to check out and see what other resources that you learn about through them. But this is definitely one where they may say, this is as far as you're going to be able to go for free, and you might have to pay for additional information unless the pandemic lifts and you're able to visit all of these sites and do all these digging in things on your own, and it's going to take much, much, much longer. The same thing with our family, where my cousin Laura was able to find someone who we both believe is legitimate in Romania, who can do some research on the family in Romania that we wouldn't be able to do, and we gladly paid for that and got some useful information out of that for sure. Same thing true of the Hispanic community. Wow, there's lots of different groups based on what country people came from, how long they've been in this country, what their interests are, and so on. I picked this one because it was scholarly. The Society of Hispanic Historical and Ancestral Research. And I felt, again, it was a good starting place for you to find resources and people who you could talk to if that was part of your background as well. And of course, for myself being Jewish, the group that is sort of the group is the Jewish genealogy group called jewishgen.org, the global home for Jewish genealogy. It is a great place to connect with. Their services are free. It's a place that we've donated money to. And of course, you have all the sadness built into this because a big part of their work, and they work with groups like the Holocaust Museum, is tracking down those millions of people who were killed during World War II. And of course, every tragedy, every Holocaust has that connected with it. So again, here's a group for people if they're trying to get started and they suspect they might have some Jewish heritage in their background. Now, here's some other groups and organizations, and again, some of them pretty good, some of them not so good. This is the family tree, and it's a template, and it's got a lot of different tools and things connected with it, and it is free. This is the group that offers its services through the Church of Latter-day Saints, that does tremendous work and fuels a lot of the great tools we have available in the genealogical world. Now, I have people who I know who are, let's just say, prejudice against people who happen to be Church of Latter-day Saints, more commonly called by civilians as Mormons. And I'm not a practicing Jew, but I'm Jewish. When I started working with groups connected with um, the Church of Latter-day Saints, all I can tell you is I have met 100% professional, nice, supportive people. And no, there was never anything like we want you to convert or anything like that. All they're there to be is helpful for a lot of different good reasons. And so the family tree place is a place to start. Now, I have to say they are not my preferred place, not because of anything except the fact that I think ancestry.org, which is a independent business, or ancestry.com, an independent business, has more of the resources I need. But the family tree is a great place to start, and you can look up online and see if your community happens to be near one of the 3 or 4 Latter-day Saints family centers that are run by genealogists to offer help for people as well. And yes, I'm looking forward to when all that's opened up and we can visit those places in person again. This is the place I spend most of the time on, and I pay $325 a year for a membership that gives me unfettered access to local resources. Now, here's the trick. um, they may able to tell me, oh, here's a birth certificate or a marriage certificate or a death certificate from a particular county or place, and they could give me the text in it. But then when I look to see the entire piece of information, it's behind a paywall, not a paywall from ancestry.com, but from that particular county, for example. It's pretty much if you want to get a birth certificate from someplace, you're going to have to pay something for it. However, 95% of what's there is stuff you have free access. And again, you wait long enough, and oh my goodness, new stuff is being added every single day. Now, they have to wait a certain number of years before they can put up the census information. And I remember I was so excited when they finally got to put out 1940. So 1940 is up and running. I can't remember how many years we have to wait for 1950, and I'm going to be even more excited by that. But there are free things you can do that, and they don't push about it, that you can play with as far as working with Ancestry.com. And Ancestry.com is one of those places where you can get your DNA done. And the reason that I got my DNA done with Ancestry.com versus one of the other sources is that it hooks up to people who are building family trees. Consequently, I've been able to hook up with about 45 people who share DNA and who are building their family trees. So we're figuring out where we're connected. And this is where I got the email from a nice lady in Alabama who said, I think I think you're related to my grandma Marilyn. Of course, was my Aunt Marilyn, and that was the nest of cousins who we lost contact with like 30 or 40 years ago. And we called each other up, and she cried and cried. She was so happy to be connected, and it was because of the DNA. And so, um, anyway, ancestry.com is worth checking out. And if you can put a few pennies together, from my point of view, and I don't get a commission for this, I just think it's one of the best places that you can spend money if you have a little money to spend on your research and so on. So, who else do we have out there? Well, of course, we have the Library of Congress, and people forget all the free resources are there. There obviously are books and films, but there's all sorts of oral histories of different groups of people from different parts of the country. I've been there in person doing research for a book that I did, and it was awesome then, but digitized images of newspapers. And remember, there's a lot of stuff that went into newspapers that don't go into the average big newspaper anymore. If you're from a small town, you'll have those birth and death records and so on. But for example, when my when my husband's father and mother had their engagement party in New York State, the local newspaper had a very, very, very lengthy article about who was there and what people were wearing and all sorts of information that you couldn't get anyplace else, but that's what you could find in a newspaper in that particular day. So you're going to find some pretty cool stuff going through the Library of Congress. And again, um, a little bit at a time, a little bit at a time. No one on the planet should be bored if they have access to the Library of Congress website, in my personal opinion. So where do you get started? Now, this is an interesting photo because this is the only photo in existence of my family together. Um, I'm the little girl in the middle in the front, and that's my mom and dad, and that's my sister. So what we have here is the connection between my dad's side of the family, who are from Romania and Poland, and my mother's side of the family from White Russia. And this is where our branch started. and goes out into the world. So sometimes what you have to do is you start where you are, and that means you start at home. So, what do I wish people had told me when I first got started? First of all, get organized. Think of it as a research project. Think of it as the biggest term paper in the world. Think of it as your doctoral thesis. And what you want to make sure is you've got some file folders, you've got a file cabinet, maybe you have a place on a wall where you can put a map. So, you want to understand that you are going to be inundated with a huge amount of information over the rest of your life. And it's not just what's on computer, it's being able to organize things as a legacy for the next people. You don't want to have to go through what I've gone through for my husband's family and my family, spending months and months and months going through disorganized files of paper. And I don't want to leave that for the people that I'm leaving behind. And what you're going to be doing is keeping track of people and stories, thinking about how can I share this with other people. So it might just be a file drawer, but some place that you can have physical files is really useful, not mixed up with everything else. And no, you don't have to spend a lot of money. A lot of the forms that you need are free. And as I said before, beware of fancy software. You don't need that. So one of the neat places that you can get resources to get you started is with the National Archives. Again, remember um, Indiana Jones and the Lost Ark, the last scene, and they have places just for resources. And before I mentioned the preservation stuff, if you go to archives.gov/research.genealogy, they'll have all sorts of stuff, including free forms that you can download and copy and use to start organizing your information. What about old school resources? And this was something we were able to find from Find a Grave. And this is the gravestone of my great grandmother and great grandfather, the Bankendorfs from Poland. And this was my dad's maternal grandparents, Tilly and Morse. And meant a lot when I was able to find this information and share it with the rest of the family. Old school resources, uh, you're going to be scouring through people's photo albums and scrapbooks. We found a lot of valuable information going through physical address books that people had for names and people that we didn't even know exist. Attics, of course, local government offices, library vertical files, which is where libraries keep a lot of the non-book information, and senior organizations. Local clubs and senior organizations often have their own archives that you can check out as well. What about DNA? Now, this is from the paternal side of my dad's family. This is my great-grandfather, Sam, and my great-grandmother, Lena, from Romania, right? The other side from Morris and Tilly. What about DNA? Well, the cons have to do with those privacy and legal issues, the can of worms of relatives who you don't want to know they're related to you, and all of the inaccuracies. But for me, finding lost branches and helping people who didn't know they had family and being able to better connect internationally with people has far outweighed the cons for me. But it's a decision that everyone has to make on their own, I believe. That's important. So when you get stuck, and this is a great photo we were able to dig out of my older sister, one of my favorite photos. I want you to be a super girl like my older sister. Sometimes you have to broaden your search. Everyone in the family says we're from Pennsylvania. Well, maybe you were from New Jersey or Vermont or Texas or Nebraska. Maybe you can work on a different part of the search. Maybe it's time to do just some historical research, about what was going on in the world when your family was either coming to America or coming to Nebraska or whatever. Maybe it's time to interview some more relatives. Fill them in on what research you're doing might trigger some memories for them. Maybe you need to post on one of the boards that they have saying, "Hi, I'm from this family and I'm looking for this kind of research," or to revisit an old source that you have as well. So this kind of gives you an idea of some of the resources that are out there. I'm going to turn things back over to Kim and see if we had any questions.
Hi, Pat. Thank you. Yeah, if anybody has some questions for Pat, please put them in the chat or the Q&A, and she can go ahead. We don't have any in right now, Pat, but if you have any, I'll give you a couple 10, 15 seconds to write it in.
Hmm.
20 seconds. See if we have anything. I am not seeing anything. Well, I will say then we might just finish up. Well, everybody, thank you so much for joining us for today's webinar. We post all of our past webinars. We record them and they all get posted on our YouTube, DoSpace YouTube channel. So if you'd like to rewatch this webinar or any of our past ones, you can always go to our YouTube and then search for DoSpace and you'll be able to. Oh, we got a question. Here we go. There is a mystery in my family that I'd like to get some help on. My great grandmother was gone for about 12 years and no one knew exactly where he was. Oh, great grandfather. Sorry. Great grandfather. I found that he was in a sanitarium. Sanitarium in a VA hospital in Minnesota. I'm wondering how I might find more information about why he was there.
That's really interesting when you come to medical records. And what I would suggest is this person contact me, Pat at patternresearch.com, since we're near the end, and see if I can put her in touch with some folks, particularly if I know where they are, because I work a lot with medical librarians, and I may be able to find someone who has some advice for her to get her started.
Okay, Madeline. Yep. Patternresearch.com is
Yeah, and I
where.
don't charge for email or phone consultations, so you don't have to worry about that.
There we go. Well, we'll see if we get another question in and then. Excellent. Thank you, Madeline says. Okay. I'm not seeing anything else. So perfect. Well, thank you everybody for joining us today. Pat, thank you again for another amazing webinar. You're always full of great information.
My pleasure.
And thanks for joining for our Lunch and Learn. I hope everybody has a great rest of your day.